As Rachel just said, I am going to be speaking with you today about the culture material and essentially going through how this has changed in the new edition and our thinking behind why we've changed it and how we changed it. As she says, if you have questions for me, please do put them in the Q&A and I will do my best to answer them probably at the end. This is just because otherwise I kind of lose. Frankly, if I try and answer when I'm doing a webinar solo like this, if I try and answer your questions as they come in and also keep track of time and also run through my presentation, it's all going to get a bit confusing and I'm going to lose track of something. So this way, at least this is the best way that you are most likely to get all of the correct information and all of your questions answered in a way that actually makes sense. So I want to take us back to basically the beginning of the reading method. As many of you are probably aware, well, actually, hopefully all of you, if you are current CLC users, are probably aware that it is a reading method textbook. I use the reading method. This was developed back in the 1960s by Dr. John B. Wilkins, who was the original linguistic consultant for the CLC. He worked with the then director of the project and his team to essentially come up with a new way of approaching the study of Latin. This is specifically involved the interconnectedness of three skills which he considered desirable for Latin reading fluency. These were the ability to process information conveyed in unseen text suitable to their level, the awareness of the cultural context of the use of the language, and the appreciation of the literary conventions characteristic of the literature. And one of his most innovative and long-lasting conclusions about all of this was that all of this should be taught at the same time as a coherent whole. It wasn't a case of you do one thing, then you do the other. They should all be feeding off of each other. In the CLC, it has always been the case, well, since the integrated editions and everything being in one book, that the cultural material comes at the end of the stage. This is actually more to do really with the restrictions of publishing on a page. You know, essentially, you can't have a book that's magic like Harry Potter and stuff moves around depending on where you're going to put it in your lessons. It has to go somewhere, and it has to go somewhere consistently so that you can always find it. This is why the cultural material has traditionally been at the end. The problem with this, of course, is that then people think of it as the bit that comes at the end or the tag on or something that you do when you finish the language, and that integration doesn't always happen. So this is not just a CLC thing. As we move forward in time, those of you who, well, many of you will probably be very familiar with the graphic on the right. Obviously, this is the actful kind of culture triangle. I don't know if there's actually a term for it. I refer to it as the culture triangle. And essentially, these are the this is the advice that ACTFL gives as to how our learners should be interacting with culture during the study of languages, including ancient languages. So in specifically, the thing I want to highlight are the bits that I've left bolded here are the verbs investigate, explain, and reflect. These are the bits that we've really focused on with our reworking of the cultural material. Up until this point, the cultural material was often a little, I'm trying to think how to put it. The cultural material was tightly tied to the stories and provided really, really helpful contextual information to enable students to understand the Latin. That's perfect and brilliant and what it's for. But what we have discovered through watching people teach and talking to people is often because it doesn't come with a sort of a built-in set of teaching ideas, or it doesn't push people in one particular direction, people are often using this as a set of sort of facts to be learned as opposed to content to be investigated. And not only is this obviously not great from an academic point of view, also it's not actually addressing these actual approaches and the approach that you'd see in most sort of language rubrics. Usually what we want students to be doing is not just recalling details about culture, we want them to be investigating it, able to explain it, and able to reflect upon it. So in addition to just thinking about the importance of culture for reading proficiency and things like the ACTFL standards, I also want to centre us very much on our learners and our discipline. So, for example, we often think of our learners, of course, of being language enthusiasts. This is a Latin textbook. It hopes if you like language. But you've got so many different kids in front of you. Yes, you've got language enthusiasts. The other people you have in your classics classroom are going to be fans of the ancient world, fans of history in general, or some random children who read Percy Jackson and thought they'd give it a go. All of these things, all of these people are in your classroom. And if we're going to continue to have a healthy discipline, I don't need to keep all of them, or at least as many of them as we can. We also then have to reflect more widely on our actual discipline, academically speaking. Again, sometimes because we are primarily teaching Latin, we may be really focused on the fact that classicists are our linguists, our Latin and Greek specialists, our philologists. But in reality, when we look at our wider discipline at a university or collegiate level, we see historians, philosophers, literary scholars, and archaeologists, all of whom are within our discipline and all of whom belong there. And so what we've tried to do with the CLC, the new edition of it, is we've tried to really reflect upon the fact that we're not just teaching Latin to language enthusiasts who might go on to be philologists. We are also teaching a huge range of knowledge and skills to students who may stay within our discipline, but may use their knowledge of Latin to move sideways into one of the other areas of it. I myself, my background is primarily history. I often joke that I'm probably actually got a philosopher's brain. I was a historian of thought, so I essentially basically had one toe over the line into philosophy most of the time. And I've often said that my view of my grasp or my view of my learning of the languages, to be honest with you, the learning of the languages was always for me far more about accessing history and philosophy than it was accessing a deep and meaningful understanding of how the Romans used the subjunctive. So essentially, what we think the cultural material is really important for doing is actually upskilling students across the board in the classical subjects. We also want to talk about, essentially, it is no secret that we as a discipline are going through a period in which we are reflecting deeply on what it means to actually study our discipline. Why are people studying Latin? And also, we are really aware of the appropriation of classical knowledge by groups with whom we may not have much in common, or we may wish, frankly, they would stop using our material to spread really unpleasant messages. And so this has often led to people having conversations about how do you solve a problem like the Romans? How do we talk about a society which was slave owning, which was patriarchal, which was brutal and imperialistic? How do we talk about this society without condoning or accidentally supporting problematic narratives in the modern world? And actually, one of the things that I have long been an advocate for is we solve the problem of the Romans by saying that they aren't the problem. The Romans aren't our problem, if that makes sense. The attitudes and the way in which we approach the study of the Romans, that's where things become problematic. The Romans are the Romans. And so we need to start thinking about how we unpick our study of it, especially with our students. So, for example, too often as a teacher, we see students, not only at lower levels, at high levels as well, for whom Tacitus, Caesar, or Pliny telling us something happened, we forget to reflect deeply on who these people are, why they're telling us that happened, and whether or not we actually think it really happened. We often see people sort of sitting on the shoulders of the Romans, to quote my colleague Lisa. Sometimes because we study the Romans so much, we almost feel that there's an implicit acceptance of things because the Romans did it. Whereas actually what we want to be doing is applying a critical lens to their actions, as opposed to automatically assuming that there is some kind of civilizing or progressive narrative. We also need to be training ourselves and our students to think about what our sources don't say. Essentially, the hidden voices, as we are becoming increasingly aware these days, are as important as the really loud ones in our source record. We also need to get away from simplistic understandings, both of the narratives within the book, but also the narratives within the historical record. An awful lot of the debates one sees in the media, which involve the ancient world, in my opinion, can pretty much be summed up as it's a bit more complicated than that. Most misconceptions are based on deeply simplistic understandings, and if we tackle the thinking which produces simplistic understandings, we can go some way to actually addressing this. We also have the sort of what I refer to as the standard misconceptions. For example, the idea, this is a really sort of flippant example. We still have the arguments, well, I do, maybe the rest of you are spending time with far more enlightened people, but I still have to tell people that the statues weren't white originally, and it still blows the average person's mind who has never actually heard of polychromy and has never ever studied the ancient world in depth and had no idea that the marble statues were painted and weren't white. Sort of misconceptions that like this are really deep in the psyche, and actually the only way we address them and we help people to understand the actual complexities of the ancient world and the reality of the ancient world is to improve our thinking about it. And finally, I want to finish on something that has been leveled at us whilst we are rewriting these books, the idea of rewriting history. I would just like to take this opportunity to affectionately quote a historian here in the UK called Greg Jenner, who, whilst being rather annoyed with somebody on Twitter, because let's be honest, we've all been there, who was accusing him or accusing somebody else of rewriting the past. And Greg Jenner popped up and said, "History is literally rewritten every day. You're confusing it with the past. The whole point of history is that we rewrite it and we reassess it, and the history is the process of construction of claims and interpretations. That is what the historical discipline is. The historical discipline is not us taking a mental photograph of the past and knowing exactly what happened. If it was, we would have stopped doing it a long time ago because we would have had all the answers." So with all of that in mind, basically we have upskilled the historical thinking skills in the new book. This is a brief passage from a blog post. The link is at the bottom of the slide, of the CSCP blog. And this was actually a conversation with a teacher in the UK, Lottie Mortimer, who trained primarily as a history teacher, but is now a classics teacher. She also acted as one of our she's acted often as one of our consultants on our historical and culture sections. Lottie, I think, despite being a UK teacher, her points are not UK based. I think she basically says something here which I think is pretty much universal. History doesn't make you a better person, but there's something in it about understanding other people. It's important for understanding information, for source analysis and provenance. One of the most valuable things about history going forward is to get us thinking about our information, whose stories we are telling, where we're getting them from, the reasons they were written. When we are overwhelmed with information and fake stuff, what is true? And this is so basically what we're dealing with here is, as the slide says, better historical skills are better thinking skills, they're better critical skills. And these are all things that we really wanted to encourage you guys who are using the books and your students to really be developing in the classroom. So when we were working on this, we looked very much to our colleagues in the history teachers, essentially. Their pedagogy is very different to ours, as you'd probably expect. But also there have been massive developments in recent years in history pedagogy about how we do things like ask questions, how we encourage students to do meaningful inquiries into the past, and how we encourage them to think about the difference between knowing something and being able to make claims and analyze and think critically about it. So this is a diagram that, again, I know it's from a UK document, but again, I'm sure I could find a similar thing for the US maybe, but it's a universal. Good historical study and good historical teaching involves a combination of factors. It involves us allowing students to engage with a valid historical inquiry or investigation. It involves students actually knowing stuff. It involves having historical knowledge, but then it involves what is often referred to in history teaching over here as second order historical concepts, which is a mouthful and not a great phrase, but it does work. Students have to understand the nature of things like evidence, interpretation, cause, change, similarity and difference, and significance if they're going to understand the cultural material. So it's not just knowing things, it's being able to understand them in the context of those concepts. And finally, it's really important to think about how students are communicating. How are they then forming this knowledge and understanding into some form of product which is enabling them to address that inquiry, that investigation directly. So having given you all of this background, and we are going to be moving on to talking about the types of questions you get in the book. There was a huge debate over what we called the main questions that are in the cultural material. You guys have ended up with investigation or investigate questions. But frankly, depending on what blog, history association, teaching association, or person you're speaking to, you can find questions called anything from inquiries, compelling. You know, it's essentially, it's just a big question. It's an investigation. It is something that involves a student delving deeper and thinking more carefully. And we really took to heart these ideas about good questions. So on the left is actually from the American Historical Association. I thought it was a really interesting kind of thing to highlight the idea of forced choices between moral absolutes, abstract queries that have no basis, you know, ethical or civic concern, but no actual historical basis, or overly fanciful counterfactuals, all of which we've tried to obviously avoid. And we've tried to make sure that these are properly interesting inquiries which are addressing something within the material. These are about addressing historical thinking skills. So, having just told you the reasons behind what we've done, I want to start illustrating them a bit. So these are a selection of inquiry questions or investigate questions which appear across units 1 and 2. These questions are in every single stage. They appear at the beginning of the culture material. They are then repeated at the end of the culture material with some bullet points, which essentially kind of highlight to the student the stuff that they've hopefully just read that is relevant or particularly relevant to the investigation. We actually toyed with putting these questions on the first page of the stage, on the stage page, in order to actually get people thinking about that question all the way through the stage. We decided against this after an awful lot of debate, because we didn't want it to look like we were putting the culture before the language rather than having it integrated. We actually still go backwards and forwards on this. We've had consultants say that we did the wrong thing, it should have gone on the stage page. We've had people say that it's in the right place. I think what this shows, it depends on the kind of teacher you are and as to where you think it should land. But it's important to recognise that that debate is something we've had. And if you are and there are particular stages where actually the stories themselves and that investigation of the Latin can be an interesting and important element of investigating that question. So as we walk through these investigate questions, we start off in stage 2. How did Caecilius, Metellas and Grumia's daily activities reflect and reinforce their different social statuses? So basically, this question is it's a very early one, and it's also very straightforward. Essentially, what you've got here is a recall activity in some ways. Students are expected to, the knowledge you're looking for is knowledge of the activities of Caecilius, Metella and Grumio. And then the critical activity is basically them thinking about the status of these individuals and sort of linking it up with the daily activities and how they are reinforcing it. This is a question which is asking more about just what does the day in their life look like. We want to also have students thinking that little bit deeper about social statuses and Roman society. By the time we get to stage 9, this is a slightly different type of question. It's how much do we know about a typical visit to a Roman bathhouse? Again, this is not what is the typical visit. This is not just a knowledge recall. This is about students reflecting on the nature of the evidence. How much can we actually say we know for sure? The answer, by the way, being not an awful lot, to be completely honest. We actually don't know much about how most people use the baths, not in not in kind of the detail that sometimes it's portrayed. The idea of there being a set order of things is something that now scholars are a little bit more dubious about. By the time we get to stage 12, this understanding of evidence and sources, we've kind of pushed it a bit further. And we're actually taking a step even further back and talking about the sites of Pompeii and Herculaneum as we say goodbye to them in the unit, thinking about them as historical settings, as the remarkable sites that they are. We thought it would be a really valuable moment for students to reflect on what these sites have actually given to classicists about our understanding of the Roman world. We then go into Unit 2, we're now in Roman Britain, and we think about how Roman it was. And here we're beginning to bring in more complex ideas about conquest and imperialism. And then by the time we get to stage 18, we're thinking about the idea of migration and culture and how cultures change each other and how movement of peoples affects culture and identity. Finally, in stage 19, the final one here is another one that's about historiography and the idea of claims. And this one again is getting at these ideas of culture and imperialism and sometimes our missing voices in the source record, because they are then going to be reflecting about the worship of Isis. And so there's knowledge about Isis inherent there, but also an idea of thinking about how we know about the worship of Isis and why it's really difficult for us to actually make real claims about it, and actually trying to get them to unpick some of those assumptions that sometimes students will make. For example, we know, and it says so in the book, that the worship of Isis looks very different in Egypt to the rest of the Roman world, and yet a lot of our sources are from the wider Roman world, which means that actually often our ideas about what Isis worship looks like are very much coloured by texts and sources from elsewhere, and often they are actually applied to Egypt, where we know those things probably aren't quite accurate. In addition to the investigate questions, which start each of the culture essays or materials, we also have a new feature called the thinking points. Thinking points are incredibly varied. We deliberately did not come up with a rubric for them or a really strict formula. You will find anything from between 5 and 12 per culture stage, depending, frankly, on how much the information lent itself to a thinking point, if I'm completely honest. They range, they are literally what they sound like. It is all about essentially what do we want students to think about? Where do we think these things can go? How do we think people can make, whoops, I did not mean to do that. Let's go backwards. There we go. How can we make these things more resonant, or how can we get students to think a bit deeper? So they come in many, many types. These are just some examples. Again, these are all pulled from across units 1 and 2. We have source work, for example, in Unit 2, when students are learning about the debate regarding toggy-dubnesses and rather than coggy-dubness. Sorry for those of you who aren't aware of this, we have changed it. We summarise the source debate or the reasons why it's been changed, and we ask students to, with reference to sources, briefly explain. So we're getting students to look at and sort of summarise and reflect and demonstrate they've understood what they've just read, essentially. We then have questions which widen understanding, and we ask students to speculate and think. Why do you think wealthy Romans might have encouraged passersby to peer into their houses? There is no correct answer to this question, really. I mean, there are mad answers, but there's no real correct one. These questions are about making students pause, reflect, and maybe think a bit wider. We also have very basic recall, not basic, but we have recall tasks, because as we know, as we develop through the stages, knowledge that they gained in earlier stages can be recalled and be very useful in later ones. So we ask them things like, think back over previous stages. What tasks have you seen being done by enslaved people? This encourages them to see that coherent narrative, that coherent whole of the course, and also make sure that they're checking in on that knowledge base, not just learning something because it's important to the stage they're in, and then forgetting it. We also develop source skills. So this particular thinking point sits in stage 6. It is next to a relief of 2 war captives who are about to be carried in a triumphal procession. This is a very basic source question, and it asks students to reflect on the Roman attitudes to war captives that they can glean from this particular source. We also have critically evaluate. For example, how useful Tacitus is as a source for a particular passage of Tacitus, which is in the book, for a historian investigating Boudica. We ask them to make connections across stages, sometimes where there is something that we can reflect upon and they might join up their knowledge. So, for example, in stage 18, when we have a bit about how the Romans used Egyptian gods and their imagery, and how similar is that to the Greek relationship with Egyptian gods like Isis. This is all context within the textbook, contextualized, within the textbook. Sorry, I have 2 kittens and one of them has just climbed something behind me. I'm really sorry if everybody heard that. She's called Artemis, it suits her. How is that similar to the Greek relationship with Egyptian gods like Isis? And then finally, we have the global or modern context, where we encourage students to look at the modern context, to draw parallels, to think more widely. We might ask them to make comparisons with other societies, or in the case of this one, it's a very, very simple question. They have a map of the positioning of ancient Gaul and asking them to think about what modern countries are part of ancient Gaul and place themselves in that kind of geographical setting. So one thing I want to be really clear about, there are questions everywhere in the books now. There are questions everywhere. They are designed to make your life easier, not as a way to increase pressure. Please do not be sitting there listening to me saying this and thinking, oh God, I barely have time to teach the course as it is. I need there to, I can't believe I now have to do all this extra work. You do not have to do all of them. Really, I really mean it. These are there. We are anticipating that you will not necessarily use the investigation questions for every stage. You will probably have stages for which you particularly like the investigation, or you feel this is a topic that you want to involve your students in slightly more. Equally with the thinking points, we actually are thinking that people will use a couple from each stage and will maybe set them as a task, maybe use them as a stimulus for a class discussion. We are not anticipating people using all of them. The reason there are so many of them is so that you can actually pick what works for you. Not everything in the stage feeds directly into the investigative question. Please don't necessarily go hunting for some kind of link. The investigate question is there as a sort of prop for the stage. It is part of the stage. Not everything is pulling in the direction of that question. That's one of the reasons, by the way, we did not put it on the stage page in the end. If you're not sure what to focus on, if you're slightly overwhelmed by the amount of questions, just take stock. What do you think your students need at this time? Have you noticed that they're really struggling to engage with the ancient world because they're not really thinking about its connections to the modern one? And are there some thinking points in this particular stage that would actually really speak to that and would make that a really, therefore be really helpful for your students? Have you noticed that they're forgetting things in between stages, or you're not sure they were paying attention when you did particular material and there is a recall one? Do you think that your students need more work on source work? Do you have students who are you don't think are being cognitively challenged enough in the cultural material? And so actually you want to pick one of the thinking points, or one or two, which really push those higher order skills. So coming towards the end of this, we have the talking heads and talking sources. In the earlier units, we touched on this last week, so I'm not going to dwell too long. In the earlier units 1 and 2, we have introduced these talking heads, these characters or minor characters who essentially pop up in the culture material and they talk through some of the material. This is to make these sections more dynamic, but also they are there as a real way to connect the culture material to the stories, to remind students that the stories they're reading are part of this cultural milieu. The context material is deeply embedded, and we want to make that connection really, really clear by drawing the characters across into the culture material. As they progress, by the sort of Unit 2 has got a smattering of these, what we call source talking heads, for obvious reasons. And the source talking heads, they are essentially what it sounds like. They are sources in translation. And we have imagined, this did mean that I had some great fun creating briefs for people to, draw what they think particular historians look like. One of our darling authors said that our version of Philo of Alexandria looks like, and I quote, every rabbi who ever taught him as a child, all mixed into one, which I think was the loveliest sentiment. But basically, we've drawn these characters to try and remind students that sources and authors are humans who wrote things down or said things. As they progress through the book, these become more frequent. By the second half of Unit 3, we phased out the fictional talking heads, and the only talking head style kind of things they have on the page are actually sources in translation. We've massively increased how many sources in translation are in the books, in part because we just think source work is really, really important, and this is a way to expose them to more ancient literature, because we're not as bound, obviously, by their linguistic skill, but also because it really helps them when they make that move to reading Latin authentic texts, because I'm a great believer in students understanding and having a sense of the kinds of things these authors are writing sort of in English, and that really helps to scaffold their understanding in Latin. It feels less alien in the Latin, basically. We've also increased the amount of images in the cultural material. Yes, that's possible. And basically, one of the things I'm proudest of is we've also tried to give more contextualizing information in the actual student books. Previously, this information was primarily found in the teacher guide. We've tried to increase the amount that's actually in the book. For example, the line in the bottom left of the screen has been in several editions now. We've actually put its location on. It's from a bath complex in Tunisia, in North Africa. And essentially, one of the reasons we've done this is because then we're really actually just using those picture captions and that evidence to just keep gently reinforcing to students the breadth of the Roman world and kind of countering that Eurocentric feeling that sometimes can be there. We've also tried to make sure we've improved the photography and we're showing really important things. For example, the picture on the top left of Pompeii with the stepping stones and the wheel ruts, there is a thinking point next to this that essentially asks students to think about what would have made those ruts. We could have just told them straight up, but actually it's far more instructive if they can see this really, really lovely clear picture and they can consider it. On the top right, we have a sword blade from York. This is really, really massive shout out to the Yorkshire Archaeological Trust. They have been wonderful. They gave us access to a lot of their archives, and they also went looking for pictures for us, which I really appreciate. This is actually a sword blade that was being recycled in the town. It's probably a military blade. Fishbourne let us into their archive, hence the Katia gravestone in the middle at the bottom. And then also the rabbit tibia, which is in the middle on the right. That is one of the earliest rabbit remains in the UK. The Romans brought rabbits to the country. That is now mentioned. And Fishbourne, it seems, must have been a bit of a wildlife park. The chickens in the model sentence in stage 16 now are actually based on the real chickens that we know were from probably China, that have been imported into Fishbourne, and they're mentioned in the cultural background. So we've tried to really tie it up much, much more closely. And the top in the middle, we also have one of my favorite pages from stage 19. These are all statues of Isis. We have a Greco-Roman style one, a traditional Egyptian style one, a blended one on the far right, where we see that syncretism, but also really interestingly on the far left is actually a Nubian example. All of these are given context and descriptions, and students are encouraged to reflect on the way this deity is being depicted by different cultures. So just to finish off, oh Lord, she says, getting it completely wrong, so I'm over the time. This is an example of inquiry from stage 13. Analyse the Roman view that the Britons were fierce and inhospitable people living wholly separate from the world, and the Romans would gain nothing by occupying their land. Let's very quickly run through how everything feeds into this. What this is pulling on, this is knowledge of the culture of the Britons, the resources they had, the interactions of the Romans and Britons, the relevant terminology and concepts, and asking students to understand the nature of archaeological evidence, source bias and critical evaluation, and how we make claims and constructions. We do not guide you on what that communication aspect looks like. That is something we think is completely up to you guys, how you want to think these things through with your students. This is just me putting out there the fact that this is not just about the cultural background essay. They can begin to think about these things from that very first stage page with the picture of the Britons. They have a picture of the Roman Empire now that starts the book off. And we also have the model sentences now. Yes, we still have the household of Salvius. We also have it contrasted with the household of the Britons. As we go through the stories, we now also have inserts next to the stories, where information just didn't sit right in the cultural essay at the end, but it still needs to be in the stage. We've sat it next to the story to who it belongs. So, for example, this is the first story in book 2, and next to it we have a small insert that explains who the historical Salvia Rufilla and Vitellianus were. And this also is true of Conaratio and the mining insert that now sits next to it. This does not happen for every story, just to demonstrate. Bregan's here, it's got some questions next to it, but there is no insert. This is just where we think it's useful, necessary, or appropriate, that's where it's happened. And then the cultural material, you know, they've gone through this entire stage. There's loads of stuff in this stage that relates to that investigation question. And that's even before they get to this wealth of information, which is in the culture material. This is a very, very brief summary. I invite you to pause the screen and have a read through if you want. Of the materials in that culture section. So you can see how this can basically be developed, and this question can be part of your teaching from the stage page all the way to the vocabulary list at the end. So when you're thinking about your communication activity, I just want to finish on this point. Please, by all means, you can set this as an extended piece of writing or an essay. You can do that, it's fine. However, we really encourage you to think about whether that's actually the best way to assess things. You want your students to be demonstrating understanding, not just recalling information. So very, very like questions that just like recall, or answers that just basically involve your students summarizing the cultural background section. They're not demonstrating understanding, they're demonstrating reading comprehension, which is kind of okay, but really, do we need to check their reading or comprehension in English at this point? What skills and knowledge do you need to embed? Do you want to embed their ability to speak? Do you want them to do presentations? Do you want to embed written fluency? In the case an essay might be good. How much freedom can you give? Can you be completely open with the kids? Can they go wherever they want with it? If you're pushed for time, do consider writing frames, but try to avoid just these very point-by-point questions. And also think about where you're going next with your students. What are you scaffolding? Where might you want to go? And just to illustrate this, these are the suggestions which are found in the teacher manual for this stage. Just to show we do give you suggestions, but I would massively encourage you to think things through yourself and work out kind of where you want to go with it. Okay, so that is me finished. I will pause and see if any questions have come in, and I will stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Thanks, Caroline. That was very informative and very thorough. So if anyone has any questions for Caroline, please do put them in the Q&A box now, and we'll give you a moment to think about what you want to ask further. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to paste a couple of links to the next webinars that are coming up in a couple of weeks. So on the 7th of November, we have Classics for All. So Caroline's going to be back examining the changes made to the course to work towards a more accessible and socially responsible approach to Latin teaching. And then on the 19th of November, we will have Lisa Hay exploring the ways in which the new edition works with and improves upon the long-standing language map. So those two links, registration links, are in the chat now if you want to register for the webinars coming up. And I'll just give you another moment in case anyone has any questions. You were obviously very thorough, Caroline. If you do find yourself reflecting on this session and thinking, oh, I wish I'd asked that, you can always email the cecilius@cambridge.org inbox, and a member of the team will help you, whether that's someone from Cambridge answering your question or passing it on to Caroline or someone in her team to help you. And I will put that email address in the chat box as well. Okay. In that case, I think we will end the session there. Thank you so much, Caroline, for sharing all of that with us. And thank you, everybody, for joining. We hope to see you at one of our sessions in the coming weeks.
Thank you very much.